So we're going to go over it this week and break down this game a little bit, give a prediction later on as well. So coming into this week, obviously we got a 6 p.m. kickoff in Ames. Uh, Arizona's coming in undefeated after taking down Kansas State in a couple. And the first two games, they beat Hawaii and another like a nobody. They're 3-0, but their main win over is the biggest win they have is over Kansas State. You know, obviously Kansas State this season has not been anything that anybody wanted them to be, or well, that Kansas State fans wanted them to be. And I would even argue that like the Kansas State team that Iowa State played in Ireland, it was a much different team than the Kansas State team that Arizona played. You know, they got Arizona on a short week, and they were at the end of their 4-game stretch to open the season, so they were completely burnt out, and they looked completely gassed. So, you know, I don't think Iowa State's Kansas State win and Arizona State's Kansas State win are equivalent necessarily. I don't think they're particularly comparable. And just in terms of the quality of the Kansas State team they played, I think Iowa State played a much better version of Kansas State. That said, it's still, you know, they both share an opponent, and Arizona had the more impressive win over Kansas State. Unfortunately for Kansas State is they basically just they had the same game that weekend that we did. We just played Arkansas State on the road versus they played Arizona on the road on a short week. And that was kind of the difference between winning and losing, honestly. And, you know, Iowa State got the benefit of playing an opponent that, you know, while they were plucky, they just, you know, just couldn't really stack up physically to Iowa State. And it is, you know, it kind of is what it is. All you can do is play your schedule. Jaybird says you don't get the roll thing. I don't know if I know what that means, but explain in the comments what you mean by that comment. So we're going to talk about a little bit this weekend. So the first kind of we'll talk about the Arizona offense versus the Iowa State defense here. So obviously Arizona is led by Noah Fifita, their quarterback. He's been there for 3 years now. And, you know, he was the Pac-12 freshman of the year in 2023 in his football season. And last year they had a running back transfer he was ruled ineligible to start the season, and that basically tanked their running game from day one, essentially. And it came down to their entire offense was Noah Fifita finding Ted McMillan, and that was it. That's all they could do. And obviously they struggled big time. They didn't make a bowl game or anything. But this year, now without Ted McMillan and after having found a running back, or actually a couple running backs, the offense is much more balanced. It's a little bit more dynamic. Noah Fifita looks more comfortable now as a junior. And, you know, you can't really take a lot from the first 2 games. Hawaii's bad. And their other opponent, I mean, let me just look up their other opponents so I don't have to keep saying that other bad team. The first one, Weber State. Yeah. Weber State, home of Damian Lillard. You know, they really haven't played much. They didn't play anybody the first 2 games, but against Kansas State, he had a nice game. And, you know, it's just, he's looks a lot more comfortable this season. Last year just could not get comfortable. The defense was just sitting there biting on the routes to Ted McMillan. So against Kansas State, Noah Fifita was 16 of 33, which, you know, isn't a great completion percentage, but he went for 178 yards passing, no interceptions. He did where he kind of did a lot of damage though was on the ground, 15 carries for 48 yards, which again doesn't sound like a big number, but if you really watch that game, Kansas State was having a lot of problems kind of containing him. And Iowa State has had problems in the past dealing with some mobile quarterbacks. Now, I am not a believer that the defense is fundamentally vulnerable to quarterbacks like to running quarterbacks like some believe. Matt Campbell even talked about in his presser today. Mobile quarterbacks put stress on every single defense. All of them. Every single defensive scheme has trouble dealing with mobile quarterbacks because they basically even out the advantage that the defense ordinarily has a one-man advantage um, on the field because they don't have someone specifically assigned to the quarterback. Well, when you have a mobile quarterback, they have to have someone dedicated specifically to that player, which evens out the numbers across the board. So, and for some teams that they're more willing to give up that advantage. I mean, it depends on personnel, depends on what your scheme looks like. But Iowa State, just generally speaking, doesn't want to give up that numbers advantage, especially in their zone coverage. So a quarterback that's willing to be a little bit more mobile and willing to tuck it and run is going to be a problem for every defense. But Iowa State's unfortunately this will be the third. This will be the fourth really mobile quarterback in 5 games that Iowa State's going to play, and they've all come in different shapes and sizes. Avery Johnson's a little bit taller, but he's much more of a finesse guy. Really is not interested in contact, but he can, if you get him on the edge and he can get around the guy, he's quick enough to really eat up a lot of yardage pretty quickly before before you can really get a hand on him. And then you go to like, I can't believe I'm saying this, but Mark Gronowski is actually a fairly mobile quarterback. He's obviously not afraid to run, but that's a big tank of a human being. That's a big physical runner. He's hard to bring down with one thing. He's not going to make anybody miss, and he's not like a burner or anything like that, but he's physical enough that you really gotta be fundamental in your tackling and maybe get another guy on him to bring him down. And then you get Jalen Rayner, who's not the best thrower, and he's a lot quicker than Gronowski. He's much closer to Avery Johnson in terms of quickness and speed. But he is not afraid to make a guy miss in the open field. He'll put, he's not, doesn't shy away from contact, you know. And then you've got Noah Fafita, who's really, really quick. Closer to Avery Johnson as a runner is not, obviously he's really small. He's like 5'8", 5'9". He's not looking for contact, and he shouldn't be. He needs to, if he's going to protect his body, he needs to not look for contact. But he's a lot smaller than Avery Johnson. Avery Johnson's like 6'2", 6'3". Nova Fita's like 5'8" or 5'9". So he's a little bit harder to see behind the offensive line. So the linebackers are going to really need to stay disciplined and keep an eye on him getting outside the pocket. Again, he's not necessarily the guy he's not going to try to, turn a scramble into 20 yards unless it's wide open for him. If he can get 8 yards and go out of bounds, he's going to do that. So he's unless something goes really, really wrong, I don't see him like randomly getting like 80 yards on the ground or something like that. Like you saw like Brendan Sorsby last year. He's not going to do that. But he is a quarterback that you have to deal with. You'd like to keep him in the pocket if you can. But no, he's a good passer that if you keep him in the pocket, but only because you can't get to him and he doesn't need to leave the pocket, that is, he's plenty talented enough to really do a lot of damage in the passing game. I would say I'm a full believer in Iowa State secondary. I think they're very good, but given enough time, lots of quarterbacks can find a spot in a zone. Any half competent Power 5 receiver and QB are going to find a hole in a zone if you give them 8 seconds to throw. So, for Iowa State, getting pressure on Noah Fafita is huge. Force him out of the pocket, force him to make a decision to, make him throw into coverage, make him make a decision, make him do things he's not necessarily comfortable with doing. It's not that he can't throw a run. He's a good thrower on the run, but if you can disrupt him a little bit and make him uncomfortable and get him doing something, he can be prone to mistakes. He's not an interception heavy quarterback or anything like that. It's not like he throws 2 a game, but you can get him to make a mistake if you keep him uncomfortable and you keep him kind of dodging around the pocket and you can get him outside the pocket, get him on the run, but you don't lose contain totally or something like that, where he can then just get out and get 8 or 10 yards. The Arizona pass catchers they're fine. I wouldn't say they're anything to brag about necessarily. On the outside, they've got, so Javian Watley has been their number one receiver by far, like not even close. Javen Watley, not Javian. Javen Watley. He's got 13 catches, 237 yards on the season, which if you do the math there, that's 18 yards a reception, which is a big number. out. He's got a couple touchdowns as well. That's by far his favorite target. And from there on, you've got 5 targets, you get 5 receptions, 5 receptions, 5 receptions, 4, 3, 3, 3. He clearly likes Javon Watley, but he's spreading the ball around a little bit beyond him. And you know, he's averaging 15 yards of completion on the season. So they're not really doing a lot of the underneath stuff. All of his 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 top 6 receivers are all averaging over 13 or averaging 13 yards a catch or more, including their running back Ismail Mahdi. So, they're trying to find guys, downfield, 10, 15, 20 yards downfield and let them get, some yards after the catch. They're not really doing a lot of dink and dunking type stuff. Let's see here. Oh, Aaron says, odd question. Do you think Gundy firing could lead to Ferentz getting fired after this season? We'll talk about Gundy a little bit later because I think it's it's worth noting. So, they don't have the totally elite guy like they had Ted McMillan last year. It's not like that at all. But Nova Fita is a good quarterback that can find guys in the open. He can find open guys. The real kicker here is the running backs. So Ismail Mahdi that I just mentioned, he's a very solid. He didn't really play a ton the first 2 games, but really this last game had a nice, he's their leading carrier. He's their leading ball carrier, 37 carries on the year, which, the second leading carrier is actually Noah Fafita. But so, last game against Kansas State, 22 rushes for 189 yards and a touch, and actually didn't get a touchdown, but 22 carries for 189 yards, 2 catches for 32 yards. Had a really, really nice game against Kansas State. He's a really talented guy. He likes to talk shit on the field. Is he necessarily dramatically more talented than like some of the guys some of the guys that Kansas State and Iowa have trotted out there? I don't know. Not necessarily. I don't think he's miles better than like Kamari Moulton or something like that, but he's a good running back. And it's worth noting Arizona's got a good offensive line, but they're probably the second or third best offensive line that Iowa State has seen so far. Iowa's is, I think PFF actually has Iowa graded out as the best line in college, the best offensive line in college football. Interestingly enough, but so this isn't the best offensive line they played. And actually, even in the Iowa game, Iowa State's defensive line held their own. And you could maybe even argue that they had a better game than the Iowa offensive line. So, I don't think this is it's an effective offensive attack that, can move the ball a little bit. But they're not replete with elite skill makers. It's going to be Noah Fafita extending plays with his legs and trying to find guys downfield on some busted plays. And it's them trying to gash Iowa State in the run game with Mahdi. They've got a couple other running backs that have gotten some run, Quincy Craig and Kedrick Riscano. But they're not really doing a ton. Quincy Craig's got 18 carries over the season so far. So only a handful of carries a game. Riscano's only played in 1 game and he's got 10 carries. So, they've got some running backs, but really Mahdi is the star of the show. And if you can limit what he does, even if he gets 100 yards, I don't think that's necessarily a big deal. But, as long as it's between the 20s type of thing, like you don't want to let him get the bust off these really big plays. I think Arizona is I think they're in the top 30 in the country in explosive run rate at like 22%. So they have a fairly explosive run game. Mahdi's an explosive running back, but Iowa State boasts, one of the best, like kind of the back, what I call them the back 8, back 7, second level defenders, linebackers and safeties. Iowa State boasts very, very good run defenders at the linebacker and safety level as well. So, and that's what you want to have if you're trying to limit explosive run plays. So, I think Iowa State will be able to cut down on Arizona's explosive run plays. Hopefully, hopefully you don't have any of the more of the, broken play QB scrambles for 30, for 8 yards on 3rd and 7 type of thing. Obviously you want to avoid that. And getting in long downs is obviously good. But if you can cut down on the explosive plays and make Arizona really like nickel and dime you all the way up the field, I don't think they're going to be able to do that all game. They may be able to do it on a few drives, but I don't think it's going to be something they're going to be able to consistently put together because I just am not sure that they've got the playmakers outside of Madi. I don't know that they've got the playmakers to really like dominate in the passing game and move the ball downfield in an explosive way. So if you can contain Madi and even if he's getting 3 or 4 yards, if he's getting 4 yards a carry, but he's not busting off long runs, I think Arizona will eventually get impatient and make a mistake. It's also worth noting that while Iowa State is one of the least penalized teams in the game in college football, Arizona, I believe, is the second most penalized team in college football right now. And specifically, their offensive line holds a lot. And that can happen when you have a mobile quarterback that wants to get outside the pocket and make throws on the run, things like that. And they just kind of lose him and lose where he's at. And then that's how you end up with some holds. But Arizona commits a lot of penalties. So if I'm Iowa State, if I can get some pressure, especially up the middle, and force Noah Fafita to the outside to get out of the pocket and sort of bait those tackles into getting a few more holding calls and get, Arizona into second, third, and long situations via those penalties, I think that goes a long, long, long ways towards Iowa State winning this football game. So, I said, Seth Doege is their first year offensive coordinator. I think he's done a nice job so far. I will be curious to see what happens when they play against a defense that really just doesn't give up a lot of explosive plays, and that is going to make them really take their time and kind of dink and dunk down the field, which is not something they really typically like to do. So we'll see how that goes. I think Iowa State's got, an advantage here. I think Arizona's got some playmakers, but Iowa State, give me the Iowa State defense as to win this matchup.